When the sun falls over the Sahel, the horizon no longer glows with peace. It burns with the red warning of a storm approaching. Tanks now move where traders once walked, and the low hum of drones has replaced the laughter of children in the fields. France insists it is fighting terrorism, yet the direction of its guns tells another story. They do not point at extremists hiding in the dunes, but at the borders of Burkina Faso. Across the region, a pattern begins to emerge. In Benin, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire, foreign soldiers arrive under the polite banner of security cooperation. Flags are raised, agreements are signed, and press conferences promise stability. But behind the words lies something older, colder, and far more familiar. France has not left the Sahel. It has simply changed its uniform. When French convoys withdrew from Niger and Mali, the world applauded what it thought was an end to an era. Analysts called it progress, a clean break with the colonial past. Yet as the cameras turned away, new bases began to appear just beyond the Sahel's borders. Each was small enough to be overlooked, but strong enough to matter. Bit by bit, an invisible circle formed around the nations that had dared to say no. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré watched the pattern unfold. To him, it was not strategy. It was siege. The young soldier who once promised freedom now faced the machinery of an empire that never sleeps. He understood that the war had changed. It would not be fought with declarations or invasions, but with encirclement, with quiet deals signed in distant embassies, and with the language of peace masking the reality of power. The people of the Sahel could feel it too. Traders whispered about convoys near the border. Farmers saw new fences rising on old paths. The air carried unease, but also defiance. In markets and schools, a new phrase began to echo. We have broken the chain once. We can do it again. The storm was gathering, not only on the ground, but in the hearts of those who refused to kneel. It began quietly, as most great deceptions do. The name surfaced only once, whispered among intelligence officers, and hinted at in intercepted transmissions. Operation Relink. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone understood its purpose. France, after being pushed out of the Sahel, was drawing a new map of control, not through conquest, but through connection. In early 2025, officials in Benin, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire signed what appeared to be harmless agreements. They called them security partnerships and counterterrorism frameworks. On paper, they promised cooperation and intelligence sharing. In practice, they redrew the chessboard. French instructors trained new units. Western drones flew again in Sahelian skies, and aid packages were exchanged for access to strategic corridors. It was the same power, hidden under a new vocabulary. Satellite images began to confirm what people on the ground already knew. Bases were reactivated, hangars expanded, and airstrips extended to accommodate surveillance aircraft. These were not defensive installations. They were eyes pressed against the keyhole of Sahelian sovereignty. From the coastlines of the Gulf of Guinea to the edge of the Sahara, the encirclement tightened with silent precision. Inside Burkina Faso's intelligence rooms, the alarm was clear. Analysts traced the movement of foreign logistics convoys and communication signals. The pattern formed a ring, a line of red encircling their homeland. The enemy was not declaring war, but preparing to watch every breath. To Captain Ibrahim Traoré, it was not an abstract threat. It was a message. The empire had returned, dressed in the language of assistance. While Paris denied any hidden motives, its actions betrayed its intent. French drones patrolled near Burkina Faso's borders. European military advisors arrived in Benin and Senegal under new mission names. Even private contractors, supposedly hired for logistics, began setting up communication hubs along the frontier. The map of influence was returning, this time painted in digital code and satellite links. At home, the Burkinabe government began to act. Airspace restrictions were enforced. Border surveillance was expanded. Cooperation with Moscow deepened, with Russian technicians arriving to install radar systems capable of tracking foreign aircraft. It was not just about defense, it was about visibility. Traoré wanted his nation to see who was watching. When journalists in Ouagadougou asked him about France's redeployments, his response was calm but sharp. "When a predator steps back," he said, "it is not retreat. It is to gain momentum." His words struck a chord across Africa. The story of withdrawal had become the story of reorganization, and the illusion of peace was being replaced by the truth of pressure. In border towns, people could feel the change. Traders reported strange patrols near the Benin line, soldiers whose accents did not belong. Villagers saw foreign aircraft flying at night without lights. The unease grew, but so did the unity. "They can circle us," one farmer said, "but they cannot enter our hearts." As weeks passed, the quiet tension began to spread. French diplomats insisted that their mission was only to stabilize the region. Yet the question on everyone's lips was simple. Who decides what stability means? To the West, stability meant compliance. To the Sahel, it meant dignity. By mid-year, intelligence leaks confirmed what Traoré had feared. Operation Relink was not a rumor. It was a doctrine. It aimed to rebuild Western influence through proxy states, creating a ring of friendly governments around the Sahel to contain its revolution. The encirclement was no longer theoretical. It had coordinates, funding, and strategy. Traoré gathered his generals in a closed meeting and spoke with deliberate calm. "We are not surrounded," he told them. "We are being tested." Those words would soon become a rallying cry across the Sahel. Because for every drone that circled above, 1,000 eyes on the ground were watching back. The first signs of escalation were not explosions, but silence. Radios that once carried updates from the borders began to fall quiet. Convoys stopped transmitting their coordinates. Even the sky, once filled with the hum of aircraft, seemed still. Inside Burkina Faso's command center, Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood what was happening. The war had changed shape, transforming from open confrontation into something far more dangerous, a war of shadows. At first, the warnings were scattered. A supply truck ambushed near the southern frontier. Unidentified drones seen hovering at low altitude during curfew hours. Foreign advisors visiting border towns under the disguise of humanitarian engineers. Each case seemed isolated, almost insignificant, but when pieced together, the pattern became clear. The encirclement was no longer about tanks or bases. It was about intelligence, surveillance, and psychological control. Operation Relink had moved into its silent phase, infiltration. French-backed units based in Benin and Côte d'Ivoire began training local patrols in what they called counter-insurgency operations. Yet intercepted transmissions revealed that these patrols were mapping trade routes, supply lines, and communication corridors deep into Burkina Faso. The mission was not counter-terrorism. It was containment. The first drone sighting near the town of Kaya confirmed what many feared. It did not monitor militant zones but hovered over farmland and villages. Footage spread quickly across the Sahel. "They say they are hunting terrorists," one teacher said bitterly, "but it seems they are watching our children." Traoré saw the danger of fear taking root. He gathered his cabinet and senior officers. "We will not fight shadows with silence," he said. "We will light our own fire." Days later, the government launched Operation Horizon Shield, a national campaign aimed not just at defending borders, but defending truth. State radio and community broadcasters were mobilized to counter disinformation, to tell the Sahel's story before others could twist it. Western outlets reacted swiftly. Commentaries labeled Traoré and his allies as isolationists. Headlines painted the Sahel as unstable and ungovernable. But in African newspapers, the tone was different. Editorials praised the leaders for protecting sovereignty and exposing the quiet methods of manipulation hidden behind the language of security. The invisible war deepened. Cyber attacks targeted government databases. False reports of unrest appeared online. Doctored videos circulated showing protests that never occurred. The intent was clear: to fracture trust between leaders and citizens. Instead, the opposite happened. The more misinformation spread, the more the people united. In Ouagadougou, crowds filled the main square waving the national flag and chanting, "We see through the lies." In Mali and Niger, artists painted murals of unity. Musicians composed songs about freedom. Teachers turned classrooms into discussions about independence. What began as defense became revival. One widely shared video showed a miner holding a piece of gold. "They want our land, our minerals, our stories," he said. "But they will never have our pride." The message struck deep across Africa. It was not about governments anymore. It was about identity. In Paris, the mood shifted. Reports warned that France was losing control of the narrative. What had once been managed through media and diplomacy was now being reclaimed by those once dismissed as voiceless. The Sahel was no longer reacting to history. It was writing it. Late one night, Traoré stood on the balcony of his office overlooking the city. The streets glowed softly with the light of candles. Volunteers patrolled neighborhoods, determined and calm. He spoke quietly to an aide beside him. "They can watch the skies, but they cannot see what burns inside us." That sentence spread across social networks within hours. It became a slogan painted on walls, printed on shirts, and whispered in rallies. The war of shadows was no longer one-sided. In the Sahel, light had begun to fight back. By the middle of 2025, the battlefield of the Sahel no longer looked like a line of trenches or checkpoints. It had become a maze of headlines, aid contracts, and diplomatic smiles. France's military encirclement was now mirrored by an equally powerful offensive, one fought through influence. Every press release, every summit, every handshake became part of a larger war for perception. Inside African universities and think tanks, young analysts began to call it the siege of influence. Its weapons were not bullets, but narratives. Western media framed the Sahel Alliance as unstable, dangerous, and authoritarian, while carefully portraying France and its partners as the guardians of order. Words became ammunition, shaping the global story before truth could catch up. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré saw the strategy unfolding. In one of his televised addresses, he said calmly, "They call it stability, but it is submission wearing a new name. The people understood instantly. For decades, foreign aid had been sold as partnership, but its conditions often silenced the very nations it claimed to help. Now the same tactic was returning, dressed in new slogans of security and democracy. Behind closed doors, French diplomats courted governments in Benin and Senegal, with promises of funding and military cooperation. At the same time, international banks began to restrict loans to Sahel countries, citing instability. The goal was clear: isolate the resistance through economic pressure and narrative control. What could not be conquered by weapons would be softened by fear. In Ouagadougou, Traoré gathered his closest advisors. "They are not surrounding our land," he said. "They are surrounding our minds." His administration responded by expanding national broadcasting stations, launching a network of local correspondents, and producing documentaries that highlighted African innovation and resilience. Each broadcast was more than news. It was defiance. Western networks reacted quickly, calling it propaganda. Yet the truth resonated differently among Africans. For the first time, the continent was hearing its own voice. In Bamako, poets recited verses about dignity. In Niamey, students held debates titled "Who Tells Africa's Story?" The movement was spreading faster than any army could stop it. At the same time, the economic front of the siege tightened. International corporations began freezing contracts with Sahel nations. Some withdrew entirely, hoping to create shortages that would turn the public against their governments. But the plan backfired. The shortages sparked creativity instead of despair. Local engineers rebuilt machinery with salvaged parts. Farmers created cooperatives to distribute food directly. The spirit of self-reliance began to rise from the ashes of economic sabotage. Mali and Niger responded by establishing the Sahel Trade Union, a regional initiative designed to bypass Western intermediaries. Its purpose was simple: African goods would move through African routes, and profits would remain on African soil. Critics in Europe mocked it as naive. Within months, it began to work. Small convoys carried grain, textiles, and minerals across the region, proving that independence was not a dream, but a discipline. As Western media intensified its criticism, African social platforms turned into rallying grounds. Hashtags like "Our Voice," "Our Africa," and "No More Chains" trended for weeks. For the first time in decades, the Sahel was not being defended by armies, but by words, the kind spoken by ordinary people, tired of being spoken for. When a reporter asked Traoré if he feared losing international support, his answer was quiet and steady. "Support built on obedience is not support. It is dependence," he said. "If the price of friendship is silence, then we will stand alone and speak." That single quote spread across Africa like wildfire. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people began repeating it as a declaration of unity. The siege of influence had tried to suffocate the Sahel with pressure, but it had instead ignited something powerful: awareness. Because once a people understand the weapon used against them, that weapon begins to lose its strength. As the Sahel defied encirclement, the echoes reached far beyond Africa's borders. In Paris and Brussels, policy experts warned that France's influence in the region was collapsing faster than expected. In Washington, analysts at the State Department debated whether the United States should intervene diplomatically or quietly let France bear the cost of its colonial legacy. The Sahel had become more than a regional story. It was now a mirror reflecting the decline of Western dominance. France called its redeployment a matter of security, but the truth was clearer to anyone who dared to look. It was a fight to preserve access to minerals, to air routes, to prestige. Uranium from Niger powered European lights. Gold and manganese from Burkina Faso strengthened global markets. As Sahel nations began reclaiming control of their resources, Western economies felt the tremors. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and propaganda followed like reflexes of a system terrified of losing its grip. Yet the world was no longer one-sided. Russia and China stepped into the vacuum, offering military training and infrastructure investment without political lectures. Even Brazil and India began negotiating with the Sahel bloc, seeing opportunity where Europe saw rebellion. For the first time, the West faced competition on a continent it once considered its own. At the United Nations, heated debates broke out. Western delegates warned of instability and extremism. African representatives countered with a single argument. Sovereignty is not instability, it is responsibility. The room fell silent. What the world was witnessing was not chaos, but the painful birth of balance. In African cities, crowds gathered to watch these speeches live. They saw, perhaps for the first time, that their voices were being heard on the global stage. In those moments, the Sahel stopped being an isolated conflict and became a symbol, a living proof that even small nations, united by conviction, could challenge the structures that once defined them. The empire's circle was tightening, but so was Africa's resolve. The old world was watching a new one take shape. And in the heart of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood as both soldier and symbol, a reminder that history only belongs to those who dare to defend it. Night falls over the Sahel, and the sound of drums echoes faintly through the desert air. In the cities and villages of Burkina Faso, people gather under the glow of lanterns, listening to the same story told in 100 different ways. The story of a continent that refused to kneel. What began as a battle for borders has become a struggle for meaning, a test of endurance against the weight of centuries. France still surrounds the region with its bases, its influence woven through banks, contracts, and media networks. But the circle is breaking. The very pressure meant to contain the Sahel has awakened something stronger than fear: conviction. In markets, in schools, in military camps, one phrase now lives on the lips of millions: Africa will not be managed. Inside the presidential compound, Captain Ibrahim Traoré writes late into the night. His notes are not speeches or orders, but reflections. Freedom, he writes, is not a gift to receive. It is a habit to practice. Once around him, maps of new trade routes and solar grids cover the walls, proof that the revolution is not only political, but practical. He knows the road ahead will be long and steep, but he also knows that the hardest step, the awakening, has already been taken. Beyond Africa, the world watches uneasily. The same powers that once ruled the continent now face a question they cannot easily answer. If Africa can govern itself, what purpose remains for the guardians who never left? In the boardrooms of Paris and Washington, silence grows heavier with every passing day. The empires have soldiers, but the Sahel has faith, and faith is harder to defeat across the continent. Murals of the Sahel Alliance adorn the walls of universities. Children learn the names of new heroes. The rhythm of independence, long forgotten, begins to beat again. When history writes this chapter, It will not remember who surrounded whom. It will remember who stood when standing meant standing alone. And as dawn rises over the Sahel, the question remains, will the world learn to respect a free Africa, or will it try once more to contain it? Either way, the Sahel has already chosen. Its destiny is no longer to be watched. It is to be written.